So right now I'm going live everywhere, and I'm so excited to be joining you from my new home. And we're still getting settled in. This office is way too bright, so I apologize for the sound quality, but I'm excited to talk about freezing, fawning, or fleeing. I always fighting, fleeing, fawning, and freezing, which are, why are we the way that we are? How do this ingrained kind of fight or flight pattern get ingrained in us? How does it we become the type of person that we are? And then what does it look like? One of the things I was really fascinated about was, what does it look like in a relationship? Like, how do you know that you're in a relationship with a fawner versus somebody who's a fleer or a freezer, or even somebody who's a fighter? I would love to know which one that you guys think that you are, and whether or not this is something that has been a part of your life for a very long time. So let's get into what this is, what we're actually talking about, why it happens, and how to recognize which type that you are. So our body is wired for survival. It's pretty amazing how it is just preoccupied with wanting to make sure that we make it through any given situation. And it actually has almost like an on and off switch, is the best way that I can understand it. It's like, so when you're calm, which is considered the parasympathetic system, you are digesting food, your heart rate is nice and low and steady, your blood pressure is low, you have salivation, you feel good, you feel in your body, in your space. But if something catastrophic was to happen, say for example you're on a road driving and all of a sudden someone swerves into you, or maybe someone walked into the room and started screaming at you and you don't know why that's happening, or even that it was going to happen, your body flips in, almost like a light switch, flips onto a sympathetic mode, which prepares you for meeting the crisis, meeting the emergency. And in that situation, all your organ systems, which are all involuntarily controlled, go into this mode of protecting yourself, which is your heart rate speeds up, your respiration gets really fast and shallow, digestion stops, your hands get calm, or it gets sort of cold and sweaty, funny feeling, your mouth gets dry. You know that feeling like when you're about ready to have to go on stage to speak to somebody. That's another great example of a sympathetic response. So when you get into the stage, the body's basically gearing up itself to deal with whatever the demand is at the moment. But here's the tricky part. We don't always know what the demand is. For example, if you're in a relationship where somebody that you're with kind of intimidates you a little, maybe you don't always know what they expect. Maybe you've been in relationships in the past that haven't always been safe. So when you get in a new relationship, you assume that it's not safe. But for whatever reason, we sometimes react to some things that our conscious mind, our prefrontal cortex, doesn't really understand why we're feeling threatened, but we still feel threatened. I'm going to stop for a moment just because I know there's a lot of people on the live, to let you know who I am. I'm Dr. Kerry McAvoy. I am a clinical psychologist with over 20, actually these days, like closer to 25 years of practice experience. And I primarily try to focus on abuse dynamics, but also toxic relationship dynamics, anything that's related to relationships, what makes a healthy relationship or what makes not a healthy relationship. So I'm so excited that you're here joining me today. We're going to be talking about we often talk about attachment styles, but we don't always talk about our survival styles. Like, are you a fighter? Are you a fleer? Are you a fawner? Or are you a freezer? So I want to talk not only about what they look like, but also identify how you know you're in a relationship with somebody who has a particular style. Like, what are you going to see when you're interacting with this person that tells you this person's a fleer, or maybe this person's a fighter? So I want to get into that, as well as the risks of these. So what they are, how they look or present, the kind of the risk factors they present to you, but also then how does it interpersonally show up in a relationship dynamic? Because I know, for example, if you're a person who really likes to talk things through, and it's really important to you to find closure, and you're in a relationship with someone who's a fleer, you're going to find that every time you try to get into something very important that maybe intimidates them or overwhelms them, they emotionally shut down and they disappear on you. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys about this. I would be curious to know which type you think you are. Are you a fighter Or are you a fleer? Are you a fawner? Or are you a freezer? So, as I explained, the body has this on and off switch to deal with crisis, to deal with emergencies. And we're not in charge of it. It just happens automatically. And so you may not even realize that you're flipping into it. In fact, I think a lot of times why we miss love bombing in the beginning, that our bodies, it's not that our bodies doesn't pick up that something doesn't feel safe. I think what happens is that we don't know that we're experiencing a lack of safety. We experience, because anxiety and excitement sit so close to each other, feeling wise, that we experience it as sort of one and the same sometimes. So you can mistaken fear for excitement. So sometimes we get into these initial relationships and we think, oh, this person's fantastic. I've never felt so alive. I feel so energetic around them. I'm so excited, but we may not realize that actually there's a twinge of uncomfortableness or a twinge of concern that we had, but we've been ignoring it because the other parts of it is still so wonderful, sort of like that, that lightning in the stomach kind of feeling, that we end up thinking that, oh, this is a good person. We're missing this person's actually activating our alarm system, saying that there's actually something that we should be paying attention to. So this is a very much part of our basic nature, and the way that you become who you are, whether you're a fighter, fleer, fawner, or freezer, is really dependent on a lot of variables. It's never simple. I mean, I wish things were simple, but it's not. It depends on things like, are you a person who grew up in a home that really values standing up for yourself? Were you encouraged to do that on a repetitive basis? And maybe you even were rewarded for that. Maybe you heard that standing up for yourself made you more of a man, or was you really standing your ground or showing up as sort of a bad bitch kind of a way. So there's families that tend to reward some behavior more than others, but also part of it is who you are interpersonally, kind of like I guess I should say intrapersonally, like inside yourself, psychically, how you are as a person. So some of us are more like maybe we just naturally kind of come out with our fists up and fighting, and others of us, we're a little more hesitant and more likely to withdraw and just sort of let it pass by. I'm thinking of, for example, there's a scale called the Big Five Personality Inventory that looks at 5 different types of intrinsic pieces of our personality. And these things are kind of hardwired into us. For example, I'm thinking of an extrovert is more likely, not always, but I would think they'd lean a little bit more into the direction of being a fighter, or at least a person who sort of comes out stronger. Whereas maybe an introvert who's somebody who's a little more easily overwhelmed, overstimulated by too much going on around them, they might be a little more of a fleer or maybe more of a fawner. So some of this can be based on our personality type that might then also impact how we show up in interpersonal relationships. So let me describe what a fighter looks like. And then I'll go through all the other types just so you kind of recognize them. To me, the fighter is the most obvious. Now, I think sometimes we end up thinking fighters always mean bullies, and I don't think that's actually true. I think a fighting response doesn't necessarily mean you're aggressive, although it can mean you're aggressive, but it doesn't always mean you're aggressive. But it means that you assert yourself, that you tend to come out a little strong in protection of yourself. You're more comfortable with confrontation and conflict. You don't shy away from conflict. And you may even find, I think sometimes fighting sometimes looks like defensiveness too. So we often think of a fighter as offensively sort of in your face. I'm thinking of, for example, the meme of the person at the bar who sort of stands up and shakes their body and puffs their chest out and says, "You're talking to me?" But it also can be defensiveness, like, why are you picking on me? Or how come you're always looking at me whenever something goes wrong? So it's not just coming out with your fists up, but also coming out with like jumping and anticipating somebody sort of attacking you. Now, a fleer is somebody who tends to avoid or withdraw. They tend to sort of look for escape. So whenever something kind of comes up that's really highly charged or maybe very conflictual, they're a little more likely to withdraw and just to back away, to emotionally detach. And this, again, like I said, this happens for lots of reasons. It could be because this person's biologically wired up that way, maybe because they're a little more anxious and sensitive to perceived danger or conflict. And remember, I used the word perceived. Doesn't mean always that there really is danger. It could be they think there's danger or it feels dangerous to them. It might not feel dangerous to you, but for whatever reason, they just end up finding that it feels better not to engage. They tend to withdraw. The fawner is a person who has learned that by showing up and giving people what they want, sort of appeasing people, ends up making things go smoother. It's sort of like the person who's trying to calm the intense emotions in the rooms by showing up super helpful. And I hate the word people pleasing because it has such negative connotations, but they have learned that by kind of greasing the wheel and making things go better, that things tend to work out better, that maybe those authority figures in their life or the abusers or the caretakers, whoever it is, they tend to get calmer, things get quieter, and that maybe even the fight or the tension goes away. And the freezer, and I'd be curious to see if you guys ever heard or seen of being frozen, if maybe you've ever been frozen, or maybe if you've ever seen somebody freeze, but that happens only usually in catastrophic situations, and it usually happens when there's no out. There's complete, no options. Fighting is dangerous, fleeing's, you can't get out of the situation, there's no way out of the situation, there's no one that you can appease to make things go better, and the only thing to do is you just hope you survive. And in that situation, it's kind of like a psychological as well as a physiological shutdown is what it looks like. It looks like the person just literally disappears, detaches, maybe dissociates in that situation. I have froze in the most recent relationship that I was in. When I was being narcissistically abused, I started to freeze. I think I probably had before in my life, but I don't remember. I'm sure it happened, but I'll tell you, it was a wild experience. It was really uncomfortable. I couldn't actually move or speak. I felt like locked up. And like frozen, I guess frozen in fear is the best way to describe it. And I also felt like I couldn't speak. I struggled with that moment of mutism. Like literally, I remember at one point there was something I had to say because I was feeling completely overwhelmed, completely betrayed and shocked. But I remember inside myself screaming. I was like screaming inside myself, say something, you got to say something. And it took so much effort to break out of that paralysis. It was incredibly painful, very, very. So freezing is actually a form of psychological collapse is really what it is. It's where you just feel like there's no option other than just psychologically checking out. In fact, at one time I psychologically checked out so much that I lost time. I just forgot. I just sort of disappeared. It is. Somebody's talking about, Teresa's saying on YouTube how awful it feels, or on your way says the paralysis is awful. It is. It's when you get to that state, you actually anticipate death. Think of the rabbit that's like the coyote's right there, and the rabbit sees the coyote, and they know that there's no hiding spot. There's no moving, and moving's going to draw attention. But on the other hand, you already know that you've got the attention, and there's no way out of the situation. Then the rabbit, is literally frozen in fear, wide-eyed and frozen. That's what it feels like. So it's terrible feeling. So I've talked about a little bit about how this happens. Now, unfortunately, those of us who've experienced trauma or neglect, maybe we had a neglectful caregiver in our early years. We also might have seen it modeled for us. So we might have had maybe somebody we knew tended to be a fawner, or maybe we saw one of our parents always just withdraw and shut down. I think, for example, I know I'm dating myself, but I didn't like the show. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's Edith and Archie, you know what I'm saying? It was an old show of this two couples, and he was always kind of yelling at her, and she was definitely a fawner, So you might have just witnessed somebody that you respected and looked up to kind of tended to do one thing. I have seen, and this is just me talking off the cuff, but I have noticed that when children come all in the family, thank you, Teresa. Yeah, Farm Girl, thank you so much for that. I have noticed that when you, what was I going to say? Well, I have noticed that Oh, I hate that when my thoughts flip out of my head like that. Especially, I'm sorry, I've been tired because of moving and pushing so hard. And tomorrow, I'm so excited. Tomorrow, I'm heading to Orlando to meet up with, I think 15 women are joining us in Orlando for a fabulous weekend, Strong and Unstoppable. So I'm flying out super early in the morning with Lisa Sunny, Stronger Than Before, and Rosanna Fay of Roller Coaster in Love. We're going to be hosting that. So I hope if you guys weren't able to sign up for this year, if you're a woman who's healing from narcissistic abuse and really looking to kind of capture your voice back, find your power again, I hope you'll consider. Already we've got, it's open for bookings for next year. So I really hope that you consider it. I'm super excited about it. But anyway, it's been super busy trying to get into this new house, trying to get ready for the retreat and keep my podcast and everything else going at the same time. Okay, but we were talking about witnessing caregivers who handle stress in a certain direction, that maybe that was one way that you can learn it. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I have seen, this is what I've seen, and thank you, Camille, you kind of helped me stir that thought back up, is that when you see, if you have a violent parent, like one of the parents is really intimidating and comes out strong every single time, some children are vulnerable to seeing that power and control as a solution to handling difficult situations, as a solution to protect themselves. And so you often think, well, if you grow up with a really intimidating, violent person, wouldn't you then want not to be that way? Wouldn't you find that you'd say to yourself, I'm not going to be like this person because I hated how that felt? But sometimes for some of us, it's not, we don't see it that way. And instead we see, wow, I really like the power that person had. I really want to be, maybe I don't want to be them, but I don't want to be weak like the rest of my family. So I'm going to model that style of aggression as a way for me to sort of protect myself when I feel safe, when I don't feel safe in interpersonal relationships. So sometimes it becomes a way that we learn by being around violent people or scary or intimidating people. We end up feeling so uncomfortable with the weakness and the helplessness that we feel, the powerlessness that we feel, that we almost it's what's called a reaction formation, where you go in the opposite direction and accidentally become like that person as a way to protect yourself from that type of person. It's really sad because you'd think that you'd want to be different. You'd think that you would learn from that and want to be different. But I'll tell you, powerlessness is a miserable experience. And anybody who survived a toxic relationship, I know you know what I'm talking about. It's really uncomfortable to be in a relationship where you feel threatened and intimidated, or where you feel like this person is always attacking you. And so we learn when we're kids really sophisticated strategies that can become fixed ways of interacting with other people as we get older. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there is biology that also plays a factor in how our nervous system is wired up, the kind of person we naturally are. And sometimes, and this is what I was kind of hinting to, is that trauma plays a factor. Sometimes we learn maladaptive survival skills that becomes our default, that just becomes the way in which we show up in our relationships. I don't know how many of you listen to my podcast, Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. This week, I'm featuring Lynn Strasty. She has a TikTok account. She's not anywhere else. I've been urging her to get it elsewhere, but her TikTok account's called The Echo Chamber. You can also look her up online by just putting in theechochamber.com is her website. But Lynn's been talking a lot about echoism, and I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that word. It's sad if you haven't, because the true opposite of narcissism isn't being invisible, it's echoism. I'm trying to think, like when you hear the word narcissism, what do you all think? Like so if I said, no, this person's the opposite of narcissistic, would you say, oh, they're humble, self-effacing, oh, there's somebody who's really cooperative, really easy to be around? Actually, it's not. You have to think of the myth of Echo and Narcissus. The opposite of echoism, in the story of Narcissus and Echo, for those of you who don't know, Narcissus was, I think was he a semi-god? I know he's somebody important, and he was a really lovely man, and he was looking for love, and he happened to bend over a field. Yeah, not egoism, it's echoism. Yeah, Camille, it's ECHOISTIST for echoist or echoism or echoist. So those are ways that you kind of refer to it. But So Narcissus happened to gaze at his own reflection in a lake, and when he saw his reflection, he fell in love with himself. That's sort of where we got the idea of narcissism, although narcissism actually isn't self-love. There's nothing loving about how a narcissist feels about themselves. They're actually, on the inside, they feel very flat and kind of nondescript. Life feels really bland. They feel, some feel insecure, but most of them don't. Most of them just think they're very superior and that somehow they should have what they want when they want it. But there's a restlessness. I guess that's what I'm trying to describe. There's a restlessness to them. But Echo was a nymph, happened to see Narcissus leaning over and looking into his own reflection, and she fell in love with him. And the gods decided to curse her and then took her voice away and doomed her to repeat for the rest of her life the last few words of whatever Narcissus says. So, I'm sorry, yeah, what Narcissus says. So if Narcissus says, "Aren't I so lovely?" then Echo would say, "So lovely, so lovely, so lovely." That's all they could say, is they could just repeat what Narcissus said. So echoism actually is a type of a personality style that learns to submerge themselves into the identity of the narcissist, that they're so afraid of projecting their strength and being a self, having their own identity, that they hide themselves in the container, in the personhood of the narcissistic individual that they're in a relationship with. And they become very concerned and uncomfortable with attention. They direct everything towards the narcissist. They are a reflection of the narcissist. So unfortunately, I have a lot of egoistic tendencies. I recognize that about myself when the first time I came across this term. If you want to look it up, this is the part that's so wild. It's hard to find content on echoism because it's invisible. Just like a narcissist was only an echo and could only echo narcissist's words, echoism is also a hidden, invisible disorder. Why we're not talking about it, I don't know. It's almost nobody gives it any attention. Thankfully, people like Lynn Strathby is, as well as if you look for Craig Melkin, Malkin, Dr. Craig Melkin writes about it. There's also another big theoretical thinker on the topic, and her name is I don't know if Lynn will come on today. Sometimes she's on my live, sometimes she's not. She's in France, so she's like 7 hours ahead, so this is bedtime for her. But there is another huge writer who talks about this, and I can't think of her name. It's kind of a long name, but she's hard to read. I don't recommend you go out and try to find her work because it's not, trust me, it's not easy to read. It's very, very theoretical, very heavy in psychodynamic theory, but echoism is really fascinating. So if you want to learn more about whether or not you're echoistic, check out Echo Chamber. The Echo Chamber is fascinating content. So I would say fawning a lot of times is echoism. So if you grew up in a home where you grew up around people who were really like cluster B personality types, you may have learned to submerge who you are and what you want and even what you feel in order to please the adults in your life or please the toxic people in your life. And it's the way that you've kept yourself safe, is hiding behind the narcissist, because to pop up and be present around this individual would be dangerous. It would draw attention to, in other words, think of it this way. Narcissists are people who need to have the attention on themselves, whether they're the victim or the martyr or the biggest, the braggart in the world, or whether they're just the most intimidating person in the world. I'm thinking of, for example, the cast of Succession. Everybody in the cast of Succession was a narcissist, but they all wanted attention in a different way, and they all went about it in a different way. So you have sort of Logan, who's like intimidating and scaring everyone as a malignant narcissist, and then you have Tom, who ends up inheriting the whole damn thing at the end, and he's the covert narcissist who's always the biggest, ass kisser of the group. He's always like playing the biggest martyr or the biggest victim. So narcissists can present in lots of different directions, but they're always about front and center. They believe they're better, somehow essentially superior than everyone else, so they're front and center. So when you're in a relationship with someone like that, the best way then is don't compete. Learn to submerge what you're up to, why you're doing what you're doing, so that you can then protect yourself as a way to then keep yourself from being slammed or attacked or even noticed, because around a narcissist, being noticed is really dangerous. It's very, very dangerous. So fawning often could be, not always, but isn't always codependency like what we like to think it is. Because here's the thing, codependency or people pleasing is really about getting the attention of being the fixer or caregiver. It's like, look at me, aren't I a good person? Don't you like me because look how helpful I am? See, egoism doesn't want that kind of attention. In fact, I remember when I was younger, if anyone complimented me, I literally didn't know what to say. I would like, no, I wasn't that big of a deal. Here I am trying to be perfect so nobody's unhappy with me. But then the minute you notice that I did a really great job, I'm like, oh, please, spotlight off of me. I don't want the spotlight on me. So it's really kind of this weird thing where it's codependency, but like, yes, I am so good. Didn't I do a really good job on that? Because they want people to notice how they've showed up. By the way, Lynn's in the audience on YouTube. So guys, please follow the Echo Chamber on YouTube. I'm so glad to hear that she's there. She's also on TikTok, and I hope to convince her to get on Instagram as well. So awesome, awesome content. And you can hear her fantastic interview this week on the Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse podcast. It's on YouTube as well as wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. So fascinating discussion. And Lynn, we're getting so many wonderful comments about it. People are really finding it very, very interesting. So that is fawning. Fawning is learning to show up as a way to kind of be pleasing to other people. So let's shift and talk about how it shows up in relationships, because not always do we get people into a fighting mode or a fleeing mode or even a fawning mode, but it can have like subtle ramifications in relationships where you just feel it in the way that they handle everything. So I want to talk about that because I think it's really important. Because here's one of the reasons why. Because if you're a fawner, which I tend to err in that direction, and you're around a person who's a fighter, you might feel like they're being really aggressive and scary, and that may activate more of your fawning behavior, and then you may accidentally activate more of their fighting behavior. So sometimes it's just helpful to recognize that we have a bias, that we tend to sort of flow in one of these directions so that we can actually resist it when we see it. And I don't know why I didn't always put this together. Psychology to me is really fascinating. I think I had this like almost this fantasy, maybe it's true, that if I could understand it at a large enough level, how's that for a narcissistic belief? If I could understand psychology from a large enough level, big enough map, it's all gonna click and make sense and fit together. Now, here's one of the problems with that. Every psychologist who created a theory of personality comes at it from a different perspective. So we're not always even talking about the things. Sometimes we're talking about the same things from different directions and using different words to describe same dynamics. Anyway, I don't think actually it's feasible. But here's one of the big ahas I had, and I want to pass it along to you. When you're being triggered or you're feeling activated, whatever word you use to describe feeling alert, like threatened or alarmed or uncomfortable, like you are moving into your fight or flight response. So you're naturally going to want to fight, or you're going to want to flee, or you're going to want to fawn, or you're going to also want to freeze. You're going to naturally move into one of these without even thinking. So those around you may think, why are you so hostile? How come you're just like yelling at me? I just asked you a simple question. Well, you may not realize that the partner you're with, for whatever reason, maybe fair or unfair, got activated. And that activation is resulting in a fight or flight response. So that's why it's really important to think about, how does this show up in relationships? So here are some things to watch out for in your partner or in yourself to help you understand maybe what your partner or yourself style is. Fighters tend to be people who are a little more argumentative or defensive. They tend to like to kind of dominate relationships, and they use forceful behavior to assert their needs, and they often kind of need to win. For them to win makes them feel safer. Now, a lot of you are going to say, well, that sounds like a narcissist. Well, yeah, narcissists do behave often that way. And yes, maybe some of the behavior we're seeing off a narcissist is because they feel chronically in danger. But I also want to please hear this caveat. Please, please, please. Nothing's ever that simple. So just because you say, because one of the things I'm concerned about is that you're going to say, oh, this person acts like they're fighting, they must be intimidated and feel threatened, so I need to show them sympathy and understanding so that I can be helpful. No, there are people in the world that are predatory. That's why I often use that word, predatory. They're exploitive and they're just trying to take an advantage of you, and they come out as a way to throw you off and to push their way forward. They've learned that's a really great way to disarm people, to be like that. So they do it on purpose in an effort to be manipulative. It's not a reaction. It's a yeah, what would be, it's not a reaction, it's proactive. So they're not reacting, they're being proactive. So be careful when you just want to apply this to everyone. Like if you see fighting behavior, it doesn't mean they feel triggered. You really need to come back to what's happening, what's the larger context that's going on with this individual that might explain why they're behaving the way that they're behaving. So please hear me that I don't want you guys like suddenly feeling sorry for very toxic people. They don't need your pity, for sure. So be careful about that. But if you do have a person who is typically more of move into everything that's conflictual, you tend to come out kind of like a fight response. That's good to know. You can say when you see it, well, thank you for that gift. When you can see it, you can say, hey, you know, it's gotten a little tense around here. Are you feeling a little threatened or something? Are you feeling like something's unsafe happening here? Or did I do something that sort of like triggered that? So if you have somebody who's reflective and introspective, you certainly can talk about this with this individual. So that's one way to kind of think about it, about how a fighter looks. Relationships with fighters tend to be kind of tense and a little volatile. They tend to have more arguments. There tends to be, just like I said, more conflict that happens, and they tend not to back down. They're not always good with compromises. Now, again, I'm talking about caricature. This is a stereotype of an individual. This is not talking about every individual. This is just a particular type of individuals. And like I said, please hear me on this. There are people who are just on purpose aggressive, who are on purpose exploitive and deceptive. And that's a whole nother realm that we're not talking about today. We're not talking about abuse, deliberate, like manipulative use of power and intimidation for abuse. So I want you to make sure you hear me on that. A fleer, and I also want to talk about fleeing versus stonewalling, because I think we get mixed up on these two because they look so similar to each other. But fleers typically avoid arguments. They don't like tough conversations. They don't like heavy, emotional, weighty topics that make them feel unsafe or kind of awkward. They don't like that feeling. They typically will either emotionally withdraw or physically leave the situation, walk out of the room. And you find themselves, they tend to kind of withdraw from people. They'll immerse themselves in hobbies or in some kind of distraction. They don't like to address problems. They just tend to shut down. And often, if it goes on for a long time, it may be that it leads to like unresolved issues in the relationship. So again, I want to hear me on this. There is a type of fleeing that actually isn't fleeing, but it looks like it, and that's stonewalling. So what's the difference between stonewalling and fleeing? Fleeing is really, think of it this way, it's an emotional overwhelm. It's like, I can't deal with this, so I'm just not going to deal with it because I'm feeling so, stirred up and shook up inside that I don't like this. This feels really overwhelming to me. So I'm just like, I'm backing out because I can't handle it. Right now, Jessica's sharing on YouTube that it kicks in whenever she feels super dysregulated. That's a great example, Jessica, super dysregulated. So, but the difference is with stonewalling, that's actually it's a manipulative tactic to send a message to your partner of, you can't talk about these topics. So whenever you go into an area that I personally don't like, and I don't want to work this out with you, I'll just leave the room. Or if I get really mad at you and I think you deserve it, then I'm going to just stop having a conversation with you altogether. I'm going to shut down and disappear so that you get the point that I'm in control, not you. So stonewalling is actually a form of not only control, but it's often a form of punishment. It's a deliberate withdrawal of your presence as a way to activate the other person's sense of being rejected and not good enough, and in order for you to sort of set the pace for what the conversation is. So be really aware that there are people who just get emotionally overwhelmed. And that group, if you said to them, hey, when you just walk out and disappear and there's no conclusion to this conversation, that's painful to me. So can we find a way to come back and wrap this up? A person who's not being emotionally manipulative or toxic would say, yeah, I don't mean to make you feel that way. I feel really bad that that's how it's feeling, but I just get so upset. I don't know what to do. And then I would suggest, here's a great suggestion that comes out of Gottman's work, John and Julie Gottman. They said, take 30 minutes, go separate, maybe go journal, take a walk, do something that sort of re-regulates the body, gets it back out of the fight or flight response. When you start to feel better and you're slowed down and you're breathing again, come back and then try to have the conversation again. So exactly, Tammy, you're exactly right. You walk, you breathe, you come back and you finish the conversation. Maybe it has to take an hour to do that. But the difference is a stonewaller treats like the conversation is done and over. If they've left, then in their minds, it's over and it never needs to be brought up again. In fact, if you do bring it up, then they'll say, why can't you let anything ever go? Really, do we have to be back to this again? Are you serious? So watch out for that. That's the difference between stonewalling and somebody who's just emotionally overwhelmed. Okay, let's talk about the fawning, how fawning shows up in relationships. Fawning can show up as people who just prioritize their needs, other people's needs and emotions over their own, to the point that they will lead to kind of self-sacrifice and bending over backwards to really be helpful to other people. You'll find them saying yes way too much, and maybe they might not always know what they're feeling or needing in a relationship. They're just really, really sensitive to rejection and will go a long ways to trying to create harmony, and even in most relationships, even to this point of self-betrayal. Now, if a lot of you are like, oh yeah, you just described me, that's because you guys have survived a narcissistic relationship. Narcissists love to find fawners because, think of it, what are we doing? We're giving them a lot of supply. We allow them to stand front and center. And as a result of that, then they end up feeling like that we do what, not only are we compliant, we don't rock the boat, we're also willing to betray ourselves and put them front and center and make them really super important. And we over accommodate. And here's the other problem that fawners do. Fawners often take responsibility for problems in the relationship that they didn't create. Did you hear me? That they didn't create. So fawners are so accommodating that we often think of everything as a we issue when really it's your partner's issue. Your partner maybe not be going to work and in trouble and not enough money, but you'll say, what are we going to do to get out of the situation? And whereas you should be saying to them, what are you going to do to get yourself out of that situation? Or I need to think about why I'm in this relationship with somebody who doesn't take responsibility for what's happening in the relationship. So fawners tend to over accommodate. That's a real big thing. As I said, with egoism, that's kind of how it shows up. It shows up as it's a submersion of the self for the good of the other person in order to keep things going easy and not conflictual. Yeah, it's funny. I love that you said that, Bebop. That's a great name too, by the way, Bebop, is that you stopped fawning and now you're having troubles finding friends. Part of the problem, I think, I would curious to see what you think is the problem in your relationship, is that everybody in your circle has been people who like the fawning behavior. Here's how it happened to me. I'm a fawner. I told you I have a lot of egoistic tendencies. So I discovered that a lot of even my female friendships, I would be the one that would get us together. It would be on my initiative. They wouldn't make any efforts. So I'd have to make an effort. And then I'd even see them at church or maybe some community gathering, maybe at the school function, and they'd say, we should get together again. And then they would do nothing. They would leave it to me to do something. So I would have to come back and then figure out what am I going to do, because I really want to see them, but they're not making any efforts. I found that in fact, I got to my point that my husband started saying this to partners too, or I'm sorry, to my friends too. If you want to see her, you're going to have to make a date with her. You're going to have to make an appointment with her because she's not going to reach out to you anymore. It's got to be a reciprocal. So one of my new rules is I'm only in relationships that are reciprocal. I'm not in relationships that are not. So if a person's not giving back to me, I don't give to them. I now today match your energy. If there's not a lot of energy coming towards me, because I used to be the one that would go to all efforts to maintain a relationship, and to the point that it just got hurtful and very depleted. I agree, got very depleted. And I agree, Echo Chamber, it gets really lonely when the fawning stops. When you stop fawning and everybody around you has been used to you doing it, you realize that this is what I realized. When I stopped doing that, I had no relationships. All of the relationships had been based on my effort. Nobody was making efforts because of their desire to see me. I only had a relationship because of my desire to see them. Oof, that's terribly painful. So these days, that's one of my, I would say I've been doing that for 15 years, but I had to clean house again after I got out of that narcissistically abusive relationship for sure. So really watch out for that. Yeah, Mary, you do get called the B word a lot when you start to do that. But I'll say it. I'm rebuilding friendships very slowly. It's slow at my age. It doesn't happen fast. And I don't have young kids anymore, so it's not like I'm around mom groups anymore. But the ones that I do have in my life, it's much better. I like them. They're more satisfying to me. So those of you who are struggling with rebuilding relationships because you stopped your primary way of trying to connect with people that wasn't healthy for you, it does get better. Just be patient. So, all right. So that's how a fawner looks up in a relationship. Let's talk about a freezer. This is going to be, this would be rare. Most of you probably haven't met somebody who's a freezer. I would say if anybody's in the audience has struggled with BPD, maybe you might be a freezer. Also, if you've experienced extreme trauma, you might have learned to freeze. It also might be somebody who's had a pretty significant dissociative identity disorder would have learned to freeze. But this is typically, like I said earlier, it's a complete shutdown. It's a psychological shutdown. So they zone out, they're losing time, they're not processing the situation anymore. They appear detached. They have trouble expressing themselves or even knowing what they're feeling. They certainly have trouble speaking sometimes, but it's a complete shutdown. And this is a person who's been in such terrible positions in their life that they have learned this just to mentally check out as an only survival mechanism. It's part of, they found, I think it was a study where they put dogs, and guys, this is going to be really cruel. This is back in the days before they have ethical committees on research. So prior to, I think, like 1970s or something, they used to be able to do a lot of research you can't do today because it's just an ethical violation. But they put dogs in a cage that were electrified. I think it was dogs. Dogs are some kind of animal in a cage with electrified floor. And they wanted to see what would happen if the animal couldn't get out of the cage. I know, like, seriously, I mean, come on. But anyway, they discovered that they became extremely dysfunctional. These animals basically sort of didn't learn, they stopped learning how to like behave properly in any kind of normal fashion for the animal kingdom because of that state of helplessness. So it's that kind of situation when we get into that we become a freezer. I would say, unfortunately, that last toxic relationship put me into that state a couple times where I literally froze, and it was so uncomfortable, so scary. I don't ever really, I felt terror, and I'm not using that word lightly. I felt terror. I don't ever want to feel that way again, honestly. I don't want to be back in that situation. It's really, really terrible. So I hope that's not something that you guys are experiencing in your life. But if you're in a relationship with a freezer, you may feel kind of confused by their behavior. You may feel that they just sort of at times shut down and disappear. It's very hard to deal with conflict with them. You may find yourself feeling really helpless and at times extremely distant from them just because you don't really understand what's going on. So that is how these show up in relationships. Now, I have about 15 minutes left, and I'd be happy to talk about more of this or more, whatever you'd like to talk about. I'd be happy to talk about that. So maybe you're curious more about how to get out of a fight or flight state, like what do you do to stop it? Maybe you'd like to talk about anything, any kind of questions. I'm open to that at this point. So I'm going to start reading your questions. Yeah, somebody said they did experience freezing, and it's really a terrible experience. It is a very terrible experience. Learned helplessness, great question. Learned helplessness came out of that study that I just described with an animal with an electrified floor. That when you get in a position where you realize there's no out, I think if I'm remembering the experiment correctly, they opened the door of that cage and the animals didn't leave. They discovered that no action on their behalf got them out of the situation. So even when there's actually a means of escaping, they didn't take it because they didn't believe that it existed. They also found that happened in the Holocaust when some of the prisoners were released from the captivity, that some of them didn't want to leave the barracks because they had just learned that it was impossible to leave. So they no longer believed that leaving was possible, and they kind of hung around and stayed for a bit before they were able to get them out of there. So it can happen, I mean, where you just give up and kind of give in to the situation. How to unfreeze in those situations? Camille, I don't have a really great suggestion how to unfreeze. I know for myself that when I got into that position, I had to recognize that I was doing it, and recognize that it was, I had to like almost mentally separate from myself. So there's a part of me that was happening it to, and there's another part of me realizing it was happening. And the part of me that was realized it was happening, I had to talk myself, other self through. That's how I found it really, really helpful, is to talk myself through it. I also found getting out of the dangerous situation really, really helped. So if you're in a situation that's making you feel that threatened and intimidated, I would strongly suggest you rethink if you should get, what you can do to get out of it. Here's some steps, because you guys are asking me, what do we do? How do you like stop doing this behavior? So I want to talk about that, but I wonder if you agree that the fawn will reach a point where once the fawning fails with that particular individual, that you'll just give up, almost kind of like a splitting. Yeah, I think that's true for any of these positions. I think that whenever we feel like there is no choice and none of the reactions are working, whatever our favorite reaction, whether it's fighting, fleeing, fawning, doesn't work, I think then we move to freezing. That what you just described, Lynn, is actually a form of, I would say, being psychological collapse, where you've just given up, you check out. Maybe there is splitting. That's an interesting word that you're using. I'm not for sure if you split so much as you just dissociate, you disappear. I have done it, so I know what it feels like. I did split inside because I have a really strong introspective self, observing self, is sort of my survival mechanism. But I don't know if every person who is freezing also is able to split with themselves. I do think it's helpful if you can do it, if you can have the observing self and the self that's experiencing what's happening. But so here's some recommendations. Do you guys know how to do deep breathing? That's the first big question. If you guys don't know how to do deep breathing, I highly, highly recommend that you learn how to do it. I suggest you Google diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing, and then really learn to do it. Like I'm being super serious. Like put a Post-it note up on your bathroom mirror, put something on your refrigerator door that whenever you see it, you actually stop and deep breathe. Now, why am I saying this? Because let's go back to the autonomic system that we talked about, the sympathetic, parasympathetic, that's like a light switch. So this light switch, literally every organ system that I've mentioned, your heart, your digestion, your skin temperature, everything going on is all involuntarily controlled. You can't change digestion. I can't say to you, okay, start digesting food. Okay, now stop digesting food. I can't make you do that. You're not able to do that. But the one spot that the organ system that you do have both voluntary and involuntary control is respiration. So when you deep breathing, you are actually working opposite to the sense of anxiety, the fight, the fear, your survival mechanism that's been kicked on to protect you. So when you start to deep breathe, you are actually like slowing the system down. I don't know if you've ever been in a room with somebody who's highly anxious. Like you can the temperature of the room is high and they're talking super fast. And you ask them to like, hey, let's take a breath together. And you just take a nice deep breath together, nice deep breath. It's amazing because you'll feel the tone in the room drop. Your voice will drop, their voice drops, and it starts to just feel different, like less stressful. So when you're feeling worked up, whatever your reaction is, if you're moving in the direction of you're fighting or you're fleeing or you're freezing or you're fawning, consider just stopping, learning to recognize the sign that you want to begin to do that. Like you want to like start caretaking somebody, or you just want to like get out of the situation, or you want to like defend yourself. Whatever your temptation is, just stop and take a couple nice 5 deep breaths and then pause and then think about, is that really the best response? Is that what you want to do? Is this going to make the situation better? Are you actually betraying yourself when you do this? Really kind of pause and think about the ramifications of what this is going to happen if you do it this way. A lot of times I call it putting space in our reaction. So it's a space between what we feel and what we do. If you can throw in space, and those deep breaths is a really great way to re-regulate yourself, start the, like, now, are you going to go from 100 to 0? No. But you might go from 175, and maybe that 75 level of intensity is enough that you can have more control over yourself. That's all I'm looking for. It's just a modicum a little bit of more control. So that way you can do something then different if you want to do something different, that you can at least like think about it. Do I need to defend myself? For example, if you're facing off with a toxic person, defending yourself's not wise. Remember Jade, don't justify, don't attack, don't defend, and don't explain. So you can ask yourself, do I need to justify? Do I need to attack? Do I really need to defend myself? Is this explanation make sense? Are they owed an explanation? Or am I just making myself more vulnerable? But pause before you do that to really think through what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's hard. I'm going to tell you this is really hard because we're talking about the part of the brain is way back here. It's the amygdala. It's near the base of the skull. It connects to your spine. So it senses stuff before you can think about stuff. So we're talking at kind of like a base reaction level before you even know what you're thinking or feeling. So you think about that base of the skull is connected to the whole body, all the nerves, and it's got to travel all the way up here to have thoughts about it, to have feelings about it. And that takes some split second. There's time between those two places. So I'm asking you, oh, thank you for that gift. Now I have it on my head. It takes you a second for you to be able to know, wow, I'm feeling something, and I don't know if I want to react the way I'm feeling. I don't know if it's good for me to react in this direction. So think about, when you feel whatever, for me, here's how I know I'm feeling something. I feel this pressure in my chest, like I just feel like this, intense pressure, something's tightening around my chest. Sometimes my cheeks will flush or my neck will get hot, or I might find my hands shaking. So kind of pay attention to how you experience this in your body. And if you can sense that, because that's the first thing you're going to sense. You're not going to say, oh, something is wrong. I don't really like how that, you're not going to do that. You're just going to ooh, you're going to feel the urge to do whatever it is that you do. Like if you're commenting, trolling my account and really leaving me nasty comments, my first urge is, start typing. But I need to pause, not come out fighting. I need to pause and then just think, is this really helpful? Is this person going to appreciate what I have to say? Am I overexposing myself and making it worse here? So you really want to think about that. So breath work is so important. It's the big piece of starting to increase control over what you're going to do next. And it does another really wonderful thing is it helps slowly, like dominoes. So think of if you ever set up a whole bunch of dominoes, a really intricate design, and you tap the first one over and you want the last one to fall. Now, it takes a while for it to get to the last one, but you're starting the dominoes to fall. So think about that too, that part of this process of you doing deep breathing is the starting over. So yeah, any other questions for me? That was I know, really long question, but I wanted to give this a lot of time because talking about fight or flight, I really wanted to help you know how to take control over fight or flight. Because here's the thing, I want to say something really hard to hear. Please hear me on this. And it's one that I don't like either, but I'm going to say it anyway. Just because you feel it doesn't mean you have permission to act on it. You are not your feelings. Your feelings is information. Your feelings are there to help you survive. But you're not anybody who says, I can't help myself. It's just how I feel. No, I'm sorry. That's an immature baby response. And we're grown-ups here. We need to learn to separate ourselves from just because we feel it doesn't mean we have permission to act on it. That's what toxic people do. They act on a lot. To me, I group toxic people into a couple categories. There's those who just don't know better, who are defensive and immature, and they're just emotionally like bulls in a china shop. They're just bumping and knocking everything around because they feel it, they have a right to do it. No, you don't get to do that. There are other toxic people who are more intentional, more scripted, more conniving. And they're not run by their feelings, by the way. They're run by their desires and motivations. They're more like a hunter looking for what they can get out of people. But just because we feel something doesn't mean we have permission to act on it. That's immature behavior. You're bigger than that. You're more grown up than that. So if you can insect, kind of insert, that's the word I want, insert the, I'm having, because I'm tired, I'm having one of those word days. If you can insert space between what you feel and what you do, you will make so many you'll make so many better decisions that you'll feel much happier with yourself for that. Yeah. I'm realizing for a person who's highly reflective that I struggle to recognize triggered states. I do too. I agree. I would say I'm extremely introspective. That's the same thing. That's another word for self-reflective. I'm constantly monitoring myself to the point that it's ridiculous, which is good because it gives me a lot of great information about myself. But think about why, as a Fawner, I did that. It makes perfect sense. If you're trying to fit into the container space of other people and not be upsetting, you're going to analyze everything that you do so that you don't somehow overstep. You're being super careful, so you're always moderating yourself in order for you not to be disturbing to somebody else. So it's not always for a good reason. I don't like the fact that I'm always doing it. I do try to turn it off sometimes, but it's not easy. But yeah, it does, but see, that self-reflectiveness that you just mentioned can be a sign of the fight or flight because it's out of fear. You're self-reflective because of the fear, not because you're just intellectually curious. Ooh, I'm sorry I called you out on that, but yeah, I'm calling myself out on it too. And I do know that my heavy self-observational self is because of growing up in a very dangerous situation. And so as a result, I've just learned to monitor what I do and say. Yes, it really makes me more diplomatic, a little more aware and control of my behavior, but it's not for healthy reasons that I learned that. It was for defensive reasons that I learned that. So it seems to me that when you really are dissociated to abuse, that it's so bad that your brain's on fire. That's a really interesting way to put it. I think, I have dissociated a few times, and when I have, it is a really bad feeling to dissociate. It is, especially depersonalization or derealization. I've had both, which you feel horrible. You feel like you're going crazy actually when it's happening. So yeah, intellectualizing, Lee, is another great form of detachment. It's a defense mechanism to deal with stress, is to sort of like stand back and try to put it into analytical terms. It's a way, again, you're think about what you're saying. You're checking into your thoughts and by avoiding your feelings. Yeah. Yeah. So would you agree, Lynn, that dissociation is an extreme kind? I would say dissociation is a freeze response. I would say. I think people who then go on to a full-blown dissociative identity disorder. And here's the thing. I have met people who have dissociative disorders. I have worked with a couple people who are like that. I see them as two different categories. I don't have a huge wealth of experience to draw from, but there's a group of people who tend to be more borderline dynamic, more like dysregulated. So the shattered or split selves tend to be more emotional pieces of self, like they're the fear state or the needy state, or it's more like the fragmentation is across states, not across personality. And then I have met people who the fragmentation is across personality, and they come from a worse experience where they actually are organized better internally. Like they're not so dysregulated so much, is that they had to shatter their actual identity, the self, the intellectual piece of themselves, the artistic piece of themselves, the creative piece, the relational piece. It had to shatter all these pieces of selves and tuck them into different parts of themselves to keep themselves separate and safe. And actually, there's one study way back in the day, and I think this came out in the 1980s, where they suggested that group of people they were actually more structured inside. They were really like, I know I'm talking kind of more psychological at this point, but they were more obsessive, like highly structured people that fragmented their self. Whereas a lot of what we tend to think about as dissociative states is more a fragmented emotional state, not a fragmented identity or self state. I know that's probably way above you guys' interest, but I find it fascinating because we talk about multiple personalities and do they actually exist? I do think they exist, I think they're sophisticated strategies for extreme abuse. And fortunately, they're very rare because it's too, I mean, that kind of the abuse that it takes for it to have to, oh man, TikTok's making me verify and it's being super fussy. Okay, there you go. Yeah, I think that it takes a very sophisticated mind to shatter the self for protection and very bad trauma for that to happen. Check out Lindsay. Oh, Lindsay English. I do know Lindsay English. I do watch her. Yeah. Tammy, what does she say? Does she explain her struggles? Is Lindsay say she's more struggling with more of a borderline dynamic? I know she's struggling obviously with trauma, but she's an artist too, right? That's what I'm thinking of the right person. I love listening. I want to know what to do with my ex-narcissist who manipulates my daughter into no contact. Unfortunately, that there's not a whole lot that you can do when somebody has successfully contaminated a relationship. Because here's another thing I want to talk about. I'm going to want to say about that taboo is that your daughter, for whatever reason, think back to the fawning. Okay, we just talked about all these fight, flight, flee, or freeze, or fawn. She's fawning your ex as a way to stay in connection with your ex, and he's made it clear to her. I'm using gender specific because your situation is gender specific. Could apply to men and women. Doesn't really matter. But the situation with your daughter is that she has learned that in order to keep in the good side of her dad, she's got to be on the bad side of you. She's got to avoid you. That's the only way, as a fawner, she can keep on his good side. And she's learned that for whatever reason, having him unhappy feels more dangerous than having you unhappy. So she's decided to then risk and lose the relationship with you in order not to lose the relationship with him. And in those situations, there's really nothing you can say in order to turn that around. That's something that person has to do internally with themselves. I know I just said that again. Internally is with yourself. But this person has to do this with themselves to come to the point of, this isn't worth it. I'm betraying myself too much. I'm missing out on this fabulous relationship with this other person that means a lot to me. They have to do all that work on their own. And I don't know if that's something your daughter, when she'll be ready to do that, or what will make her ready to do that. But anything you do just looks like more antagonism, like you're stirring it up and making it harder for her to navigate this really tricky, bad situation. I know it's a lose-lose. That's the problem. It's a lose-lose for everybody. All right, you guys, thank you so much for being here. Next week, we are going to be talking about, I know you're going to find this an interesting one, is how the truth about whether or not having a bad childhood will make you pick a bad partner is next week. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. And the week after that, we're going to be talking about why are narcissists the way that they are? What can we do about the causes of narcissism? And hopefully you'll continue to see this office change and take shape as you don't want to see what's behind me. It's ugly. I made sure this is not done, but it's at least, presentable. And it's bouncing. The noise is awful in here. My son's going to work on acoustical soundproofing to dampen the sound so it's not so bright right now. The sound is bouncing all over in here. So I know it's not really great sound-wise, but hey, thank you so much. And I appreciate all of you. And if you think of us over this weekend when we go into the retreat, and if you're healing, I really want you to consider, as a woman healing from narcissistic abuse, coming to either Rising Strong in February, you got 2 spots left, or coming to Strong and Unstoppable in the fall, or for Rising Strong in 2026. So come away with us. Let us pamper on you, love on you, show you a really great time, feed you, do all sorts of things to help care for you, but also while you're healing and moving your healing forward. I'm glad, Camille, it was helpful. Thanks for hanging out with me the entire time. I know you're from there from start to finish. I appreciate that. All right, you guys, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey, thanks, Lynn.